All right, team, we are back in the Fireside PM podcast, and I have Ed from Hustle Badger in the stream today. Ed did a post that really caught my and a lot of people's attention, which was this notion of the CEO tells you as the product lead that, hey, we've got to remove the whole team. We got to swap out the product team. They're not the right PMs. And I was like, oh, that's a juicy one. So thank you, Ed, for coming on to the show, and welcome to the Fireside PM podcast.
Thanks, Tom. It's great to be here, and glad that post kind of resonated with you.
Well, with a lot of people, right? Was that one of your most viral ones, right?
Yeah, that's definitely one of the most viral posts that I've written, and I think there's that sense that a lot of product people feel they're under pressure from the CEOs, and perhaps the CEOs don't fully understand them or what they're trying to achieve, which can make things, and meant that I think they felt that I heard their pain.
Yeah. Well, before we get into that, because that'll be most of this conversation, we should just get a little bit of an introduction to you and your kind of journey. Tell us a little bit about yourself, Ed.
Yeah, sure. So I've been doing product management now for probably 12, 13 years. I started out building mobile and social games first in Paris and then in Berlin. Mm-hmm. And after about 5 years making games, I moved to Rocket Internet, which is the company builder based in Berlin. Mm-hmm. That was a super interesting role. So we were building companies from scratch in a matter of days. I think the fastest I set up a new company was 28 days from meeting the engineers.
Wow.
And then after sort of 18 months there, I moved back to the UK, where I'm from originally, as you might guess from my accent. Mm-hmm. And I had a number of product leadership roles. So I led the product team at Depop, the social fashion app that got bought by Etsy. Then I moved to FutureLearn, which is a massive online course provider for universities, where I was CPTO and led product design and engineering. I then moved across to Job and Talent, which was a Spanish unicorn, working in workforce management, so providing on-demand workers for people who have warehouses, big logistics companies, things like that, and led the design and product teams there. And then for the last 18 months, I've been running Hustle Badger, which is my own company. So taking a lot of the lessons that I learned along the journey sort of as a product manager, that I was then teaching to my teams in different leadership roles, and sort of spending a bit more time fleshing those materials out, but then sharing them with other product managers to hopefully accelerate their careers.
What a terrific journey you've been on, and I could see why the content from Hustle Badger benefits from all the experiences that you've had and learned the hard way. So I'm always I find that the practitioner's advice is always it resonates a lot with people, because they know, oh, well, Ed really went through this at these various companies, and he kind of probably learned the hard way. So tell us a little bit about the motivation for that post around the CPO conversation with the CEO about the product team. Like, how did you decide to write that?
Yeah, I guess I was thinking about conversations that I've had, and I try and think about challenges that I've faced along the way and how I've responded. Mm-hmm. And I guess that was one where I was like, oh, you know what, this is. I might not have heard those exact words. It's sort of like more kind of an amalgamation of different conversations, but there's definitely been that sentiment when I've taken leadership roles where the CEO is like, don't worry about the existing team. It's all a disaster, blank slate, start from scratch.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking, that's probably not true. But it's also, I've been in enough of those roles. I often get brought into companies when they've found product market fit, they're starting to scale quite quickly, they're starting maybe to get a little bit frustrated that as they're adding more engineers and more product managers, they're not delivering faster in a linear way. And so I'm there to help provide a little bit of strategy, a little bit of process, and help them go through that growth phase. And what I've often found, is that product managers or the impact that you get from a product team is a function of, yes, the product managers you've got and the engineers you've got, but also of the environment that you put those people in. And both of those things need to be working well and be fitted to each other for you to get good results. So I guess that was where I started. I was like, oh yeah, I know that product managers are often under a lot of pressure from CEOs. They're often sort of like the ones CEOs go to when things don't ship on time, or and they end up with that sort of uncomfortable position of being by default responsible for the delivery, even if they're not really responsible for delivery.
Yeah, I guess that is a bit of the double-edged sword of, in the old days, we'd say, you're the mini CEO. You get a lot of the credit when things go well. People are like, oh, that PM must be pretty good. And then similarly, if leadership is not happy about a project, then, they're not going to blame the designer.
That's
rarely.
Right. It's a very visible role, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a very visible role. Now, I think a lot of people reacted positively to that post because I think we've all been there. To your point, maybe it's not the exact words, but it's usually something around like, hey, I think that team is no bueno, and we're gonna have to reboot the whole team. And when I've heard things like that, I come to a similar conclusion, which is like, well, yeah, we can always improve. Everybody can always improve. And that there are some good things coming out of the team that maybe aren't being acknowledged. But maybe the bigger thing is like, is that the root cause of where we are right now? What do you think are some other parts of the recipe that led us to get wherever we are, where the CEO is kind of challenging the product team? Like, what do you think are some other things that maybe are overlooked as to why we're kind of in that predicament?
Yeah, and I think you've got to see this from the CEO's point of view as well, because the CEOs aren't going to get involved in the product processes and sort that out if it's not working from their point of view. One of the key levers that they've got to run the business is just putting the right people in the right seats.
Yeah.
And in a sense, I think this is a kind of get the right people in the right seats, but it's often get the right product leader in place to create the environment that you need for a product team to work well. And as I say, I think this is a question of, you need the right people, but you also need the right environment. And if you don't have the right product leader, you're not going to create that environment. And when I talk to CEOs about this, or the conversation I try to have with them is like, if you don't have the right culture, if you don't have the right environment, then no PM is going to be able to succeed in role. And it's generally faster and cheaper to fix the environment, or to fix it enough to get results out of your existing team. And then if you're still not getting results, you've done a bit of fixing, you've kind of like removed some of the major obstacles to the product team performing, then yes, have a look at the individuals you've got in the product team and question whether they are the right people, and maybe you do need to switch some of them around.
So let's talk a little bit more about the culture and sort of like the conditions for success for the organization that underlie any team's impact. Like, what are some of the elements that you would advise people to think about when they're trying to determine, like, do we have the right culture set up for these teams to succeed?
Yeah. And again, this is my experience coming from a lot of startups in that sort of stage when companies are maybe going from 70 people up to 200-300 people overall. So I think one of the common problems that I see is that CEOs aren't consistent about what they want. So there's not a consistent strategy that persists over multiple months or multiple quarters, and it's very reactive to new clients coming on board, new market forces, an individual conversation with an investor, and that really doesn't allow the product teams to get going in any particular direction. So I think the first thing that you need to do is really establish, like, what is the job of the product teams? Like, what are they trying to do? And not only sort of have a consistent company vision or company strategy that the product teams can build into, but also explain enough of the context around that the product teams can sort of see what the CEO sees and can understand their concerns and their worries about things. So that's one kind of like really big problem that I see.
Yeah, let me play. I kind of agree with you, but for the purposes of an interesting conversation, I'll play devil's advocate. And I could argue that, hey, if I were the CEO and my CPO is saying to me like, well, we're making a lot of changes, week to week or month to month, so like you got to give the team a little time to settle in and figure out how to execute these things, and these things take time, yada yada. What I could say is, hey, look, I need the PM team that's way more agile. And, we are a high growth, early stage effort. And these PMs, like, we can't do this 3-month planning process thing. Like, I'm out there and I'm seeing opportunities, and I need a team that's going to be able to jump on them and take full advantage. How would you try and find some middle ground or win-win with the CEO that says that?
Yeah, and I think that's very fair, right? Because exactly right. Like, a lot of CEOs want to be responsive. They want to be agile. They feel they need to have that agility to survive. And I think then you get into a discussion about, again, just making sure that everyone has the same kind of context and the same, they're playing by the same rules. So actually, if you brief the product team that you want to run, in one direction for a month, and then you want to take stock and see where you've got to, what you've learned, that's fine. Most product teams will be able to do that. But they are conservative by default. Like, engineers are conservative by default because they are told to build things, stably and secure and scalable. And so you have to explicitly tell them that those things are not a priority. And what it is a priority is speed of learning. And you've got to be explicit about the kinds of risks that you're willing to take and the mistakes that you're willing to make to get that speed of learning. And then I think you can, once you've kind of taken those pressures off a product team, then they can move much faster. If you say, like, hey, yeah, run a fake door test, we're cool with that. We're fine with people clicking on something on the live website and it going through to a contact form and not a real product, then most product teams will jump at that opportunity and you can move much faster. But you can't send a product team to deliver a 6-month project and then change your mind after a month or two and expect them to deliver anything meaningful.
Yeah, you're touching on such an interesting point of tension I've seen in previous projects where, let's say, you could have a project that goes mega fast and you're literally, deploying new code every day and the product's evolving constantly based on, feedback or, new insights. You can have a product that really has the highest levels of fidelity and excellence around how it's designed, how it feels, how users interact with it. And then you can have a product that scales and is 4 nines or 5 nines and can handle like massive load. I feel like a lot of product leaders are often struggling because the business wants it all. It's like, oh, if it's not going fast enough, and you make changes to make it go faster, then it's like, well, this doesn't feel like, where's the wow in this, feature design? Or if you get the wow, but then there's an outage next week, it's like, well, we kind of cut a lot of corners to put it out, so quickly. How do you, how have you found the best way to balance those things? Or do you think that's a false tension that actually you can find ways to get most of it?
No, I think it's a very real tension. And I think one of the messages that you've got to land somehow is that, unfortunately, product team capacity is not determined by demand. So it doesn't matter how long your list of requests is. The product team capacity is what the product team capacity is. And a good product leader, a good, CTO will be able to increase that capacity by, I don't know, 10, 20, 30% every quarter, right? But you're not going to be able to take it from delivering 2 features a quarter to delivering 20 features a quarter in a single quarter, right? There's just a limit. So if you want to go from like 2 features a quarter to 3 features a quarter, that's a bit more reasonable, but that's unlikely to be enough for most CEOs as when I see it, because they've got so many ideas and they can think a lot faster than engineering teams can build things. And I think that's what almost like the central tension is that CEOs think faster than things get built. And therefore they get frustrated with how quickly things get built because they're always, 10 steps ahead.
So when you've been in those situations with the CEO that has an amazing new idea, every week or two, and let's be clear, like that is a superpower that those CEOs have, because probably one of those amazing new ideas could be the next $1 billion opportunity. We just don't know which one. How do you manage up, or how do you try and bridge that kind of tension? Like, what are some things that a product leader can do to work with, their CEO or the general manager of the business or whatever, to find, a win-win?
Yeah, and I think I should firstly say I've definitely been unsuccessful at this as many times as I've been successful. I've just spoken with a lot of CEOs who are like changing their minds, and that can be quite difficult to get them to slow down a bit. But I think what I try and do now is not just agree the features that we're going to build, but get written down the whole strategy as it is, this whole hypothesis. And that doesn't need to be, like 100 slides in a deck. That can be 1 or 2 pages of a written doc. But if you can capture sort of like, what are we trying to achieve as a company, and who are our customers, and what are the kind of main 2 or 3 things that we think will move the needle, then that can generally, or that can sometimes provide a bit more stability, because then if the features that you're building change, you can go back along that kind of that chain of rationale and say, okay, what has changed about our understanding of our customers or the market or where we can succeed that's led to that change in a feature request. So we're not just kind of switching one feature out for another. We are actually learning. And when we make a change that is backed by some kind of evidence that then gets inserted into the next iteration of the strategy, and means that you're accumulating knowledge, you're accumulating evidence that underpins your strategy. You're not just kind of taking wild stabs in the dark and then changing your mind before you've got any new information.
Yeah, totally agree on the kind of first principle strategic thinking. It's often skipped. And I think probably because there's this, especially in startups, there's this sense of urgency. And if a new idea emerges, on Monday or Tuesday, if you say, okay, well, let's spend a little bit of time crystallizing like what is the insight here and how we'll measure success and what are the assumptions, you could get some different reactions like, oh my God, like you're over processing this. Like, let's just get with the designers and engineers and start building this thing. How do you find a lightweight way? You mentioned like it doesn't have to be 100 pages. Is it literally a one pager? And do you find that 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 people are open to doing that process? Because sometimes it's harder to write a one pager than a 100 pager.
Yeah, I really do think that a one pager and not a kind of PRD, but a bit more high level than that about what is the overall company strategy can really make a difference. And I've never seen people be resistant to that because they generally recognize that that is helpful context for teams to go and build things, and they recognize that that kind of helps them get their own thinking straight. And with a bit of practice, that's something that I can write out in an hour or two, generally, to the point where I'm like, yeah, okay, as I say, like, this is our revenue goal, like this is our mission as a company, this is like broadly what's going on in terms of funding scenarios, changes to the team, market context. That's a couple of paragraphs, and like, okay, we think the answer is XYZ because of these reasons, right? We're going to go and build this. And again, that's something that, because you can turn it around pretty quickly, and because it provides the narrative that's useful for teams, it's very easy to like then reflect that back to the CEO and say like, hey, does this make sense? Is this where how you're thinking about things? As an alignment technique. I think where teams come unstuck, to your point, is like when they're told like, hey, we need to build a CRM integration because we're an e-commerce business. We know that unlocks 30% more conversion rate. And they go like, oh, okay, right. Well, let's go and do some user interviews, and we'll speak to 30 users about what kind of emails they like. And it's just like, no. Like this is like, we know what we need to build because we have a CRO who's worked in e-commerce for 20 years. This is just a capability that the company needs to have. This is a low risk thing. This is not an innovation. Let's change the world. And you don't need to go to that kind of first principles thinking. You don't need to do the same level of discovery.
Yeah, that is a really key insight around identifying the things that do require that PM 101, like let's do the design thinking approach. And then the things that are like, no, this is not, we're not reinventing the wheel here. Like this exists, like we know the patterns. And to your point, like we may have people that have a lot of experience here. Like there are some things that we can fast track. In the one pager outline that you were just narrating, I thought the most interesting part of that paper was we think, therefore, we need to build these things for these reasons. The for these reasons one, I think, is where the juicy conversations are and where you could get a lot of divergent thinking, being like, no, that's not the bet we want to, that's not why we want to bet on that. It's for these reasons. And it made me want to ask you about what's in your experience, the best way to align on the for these reasons section, because you could do it asynchronously and there's comment threads or Zooms and stuff. In my experience, some of those conversations really are much more effective in person for longer than the 1 hour meeting time, but you're literally like spending a half day hashing that out. What's your read on how best to get alignment on those core assumptions and beliefs?
Yeah. I think here the more often than not, I think product managers' jobs is to do that kind of process of alignment rather than, or it's as often to do that process of alignment of kind of like capturing the knowledge that's already in the business as it is to go and do primary research. So if you come into a business and the sales director's got really strong views about why they should go and build something, great, like understand from them why is that and just write it down. So oh, I've spoken to a bunch of customers. Okay, which customers did you speak to? Let's just capture that. Let's capture their revenue potential so that when someone else challenges us or we get a request from another customer, we can just line those two things up and make an informed decision about which is more important. And I think this is also a thing where, as a product manager, if you can just be open to the fact that there's always going to be uncertainty, that also makes those conversations less tense. So if ultimately, if the CEO wants to build something and they want to build it on the back of one conversation they have with a mate down the pub, that's fine because they're the CEO. You can still write that down as the reason and say, look, we're building this because of this reason. You had a conversation with Dave down the pub. He said it was a good idea and you want to go for it. Great. Okay. But then by doing that, you can, like, for most reasonable people, like most CEOs will accept at that point that they are taking the risk for whether that works. That's not a product team taking the risk of whether this works or not. And I think that's the important distinction, because a lot of CEOs have like very healthy risk appetites. They're willing to take lots of risks because they want to be bold and they want to be decisive and they want to move quickly. And that's where they're at. And that's fine. But you get tension when they want to be those things. They want to be bold and agile, but then they're going to blame the product teams if things go wrong. Because then product teams, if they sense that, are naturally much more cautious. They want to do a lot more research. They want to be sure they're making the right moves. And it's that research then that starts to back things up and make things slow. So when you say, look, let's move really quickly, but let's also understand we're building this because you told us to, and that's cool. It's your company. That can help de-risk things. And again, then if the CEO then changes their mind, 5 times in a year, you can kind of point back to be like, well, we started building this thing, but then in February changed your mind and you wanted us to build this other thing. And then, you've got that log of decisions where you can say, look, obviously we didn't ship anything because the objectives we were given was changing very regularly. And again, as a product team, you kind of want it's a bit frustrating, sure, but you want to be as dispassionate about that as possible. Say, like, that's fine. We can change our mind all the time, as long as we don't get blamed for not shipping anything, because it wasn't us that changed our mind 6 times. That was your fault.
Yeah, that you're highlighting a really, I think, unique challenge to being in a product team at an early stage company versus a more established organization. And oddly enough, I think there are cases where PM teams that I've led at established companies have actually more autonomy and agency than the startups PM teams, because, well, if it's a large established company, there's all this stuff going on, like CEO, they don't have time to think about your little like area all day long.
Exactly.
You're hitting your numbers, you're fine. Whereas if you're an early stage startup and they're trying to raise their next round and maybe they're not hitting their numbers, like, it's an existential focus for that CEO. And if the company doesn't succeed, they're not going to be able to say, well, my product team didn't deliver. It's on them. So, which is why those moments where they're going to kind of make the big swings, even if it's just on the chat with, their buddy at the pub, that's kind of their prerogative. The interesting kind of tricky dynamic I've noticed, and it's also in more established companies as well, is like when the product team when something's being pushed down to them from either the CEO or the VP or whoever in a more established company, and the product team doesn't have conviction, you get to this weird dynamic where either A, they're like, well, I guess we got to build this because Ed said we should build it, and then they'll either try and point out all the reasons why it won't work, not because because they in their heart of hearts want to help the company, or they'll implement it barely good enough, and then the Ed's like, hey, what is this shit? Like, I told you to build this thing, and now of course it's not going to do well because you didn't really disagree and commit fully to my idea. How do you handle that situation where leadership, let's just say, is like, we want to make this bet, and then the team that's assigned to make that happen is not convinced, and then may not implement it in a way that gives it the best chance.
Yeah, and I think that's right. That's the other common problem you see a lot, of teams building things without conviction. And I think that's just got to be a huge red flag as a PM. Like, it's much less of a problem being told to build something if you think it's a good idea, but if you don't have conviction and you've got to build it anyway, something's gone really wrong. So I think in that case, my advice would be that you've got to do a proper kickoff, and you can do that in a workshop, you can do that asynchronously, but you've got to get enough context to build conviction that what you're doing is the right thing to do. So that because all too often you'll get a stakeholder who's like, oh, we just need to build this widget, and it's like, oh, we just need to build social sign-on. You're just like, okay, a bulk upload. I mean, like, bulk upload could mean like a ton of different things depending on who you speak to, which customers, and so on. And actually, product teams get kind of like nervous because once they get into the details, then it doesn't make sense, or they don't think it makes sense. And actually, that's because they've been given marching orders with a one word or a one line description of something they should go and build, and not not like a one pager or a couple of pages like outlining it. So you do that kickoff, and again, that's when you're effectively that's when you're writing your PRD. That's when you're writing your one pager, and you're saying, okay, we're going to go and build bulk upload. What does success look like? We think we're going to build it because it's going to do this to revenue. It's going to do this to customer engagement. The stakeholder, the sponsor, is XYZ, and this is why they think it's a good idea. And again, you've got to understand, and if that's because they've worked in a bunch of other companies where it's been a really good idea, great. That might be enough, right? You don't need to necessarily get tons and tons of primary research about why it's a good idea, but you do want to understand from them, how much have they thought this through? Like, is this we've just built bulk upload in every company I've ever worked in, or is this a kind of like, no, I've spent time with our specific customers, and this is exactly what they want. And so you need to understand, what is your role there? Is this a fully formed idea that a stakeholder has, and they need someone to kind of build it in reality, in which case they should be able to give you a lot of information about what they want? Or is this actually kind of like a rough idea, which they need someone to flesh out and then go and build? In which case, you need to explain, you need to have that conversation with the stakeholder where, like, you get all the information from them, the constraints and the success criteria and the expectations and the references. Great. And then you can point out all the gaps and say, okay, to build this thing well, we're going to need to fill in all these gaps in the PRD. And that's going to take us a couple of weeks. And then we'll come back to you and we'll check it, and then we'll go and build it. And if you go through that process, then generally, I think you get much tighter alignment between stakeholders and product teams about why you should build things. You generally close that gap in conviction, that either stakeholders start to realize that their idea wasn't such a slam dunk because they start to see some of the holes when it gets written down, or product teams understand a lot of the hidden context and hidden information that stakeholders had that convinced those stakeholders it was a great idea. So you start to kind of like narrow that gap, and you get much stronger alignment about what you're building.
And I feel like we could talk about this topic for hours. It's so interesting, and there's so much nuance to it, and psychology and organizational design and behavior and science here. But I also want to be respectful of everyone's time and make sure that we talk about how people can learn more about you and the work you're doing. Like, how can they get more help?
Yeah, well, absolutely. So, firstly, people can look me up on LinkedIn, Ed Biden like the president, at least for now. And so I post quite regularly on LinkedIn, and always enjoy chatting with people there. And then, as I mentioned right at the beginning, I run a company called Hustle Badger, which provides resources, templates, courses, wiki for product managers to accelerate their career. So that's, you very kindly pulled it up on screen. And that's really, as I say, it's a combination of the things that I wish I had as a product manager, but also the things that I found to be effective to help upskill teams when I'm coaching them as a product leader myself. So yes, these are like very tactical, kind of pragmatic articles and pieces of advice.
Love it. This is great. And I'm so glad that I follow you on LinkedIn and look forward to seeing more posts by you. And we'll have to have you back on again. There's so many, like we've talked in this episode a lot about that relationship between the CEO or business leader and the product lead and their team. And maybe in the future we can talk about advice you give to CEOs on how to pick a CPO. That might be an interesting one. Like, how do you find that the right fit?
Yeah, super interesting topic.
Yeah. Well, anything else that you want to share before we wrap up, Ed?
No, except to say thank you for having me on. It's been, love the conversation. Really, really enjoyed the questions and the challenges. So yeah, thank you very much for having me.
Well, enjoy the rest of your evening there in the UK, and I'll look forward to talking to you again soon, Ed.
Super. Thank you.
Take care. Bye. All right. That was Ed Biden from Hustle Badger. Really interesting dude. I will share on the screen. Actually, I should have done this earlier. This was the original post that he did about a month ago. But just go follow him. E.D. Biden is his LinkedIn alias. And here you see he talks about, yes, it is not uncommon for leadership to say, hey, we need to swap out all the PMs. But just to summarize his post, you want to have consistent goals, minimize distractions, explain the context, talk about the money, be explicit where you're taking risks, manage the breadth, agree on a lightweight reporting process. So good stuff from Ed. Some thoughts on my side. I think the main takeaway for me is the need to find this balance between the top down and bottoms up kind of innovation planning. And any extreme is unlikely to result in a successful outcome. If it's all top down, a former manager of mine many years ago said, none of us is smarter than all of us. So you want to harness the collective intelligence of the organization. So you can't just be an order taker tops down. On the other hand, if it's bottoms up entirely, then that team is not going to benefit from the vantage point, visibility, insights, vision of the most senior leadership in the organization. So that's not good either. That's kind of a local maxima issue. Now, that then leads you to this hybrid approach where you're going to have some key top-down, like core assumptions, beliefs, and then you've got a lot of bottoms-up innovation as well. My advice on the top-down stuff is try and help your senior leadership articulate what are the core beliefs that they have, the hunches, the spider senses, the intuitions, the insights, the strategic bets that they're trying to make, and crystallize that. That's more important than the feature lists or the feedback on this design or that design, or even looking at the whole roadmap. Because usually where you get into those disagreements, when you're at that artifact level is because you're not hearing a crucial insight or assumption that they have. And so that's an art, and it's hard. Then you get into these weird permutations where it's like, well, what if I understand senior leadership's core beliefs, but I don't agree with it? Now you're going to be in this position where you have to disagree and commit the whole time. We could go through those scenarios, but generally there's one huge belief that, like, let's say that VP or that CEO has. You can work that into the roadmap. It doesn't have to be your entire roadmap. Maybe it's 20% or 30% of it, and they can usually live with that because they know they may not be 100% right. What they want to know is that you've heard them and that you are going to make a full-throated effort to execute on that assumption and that belief and that bet. And if you can do that, then that kind of gives you the permission to and the latitude to have the rest of your portfolio where you have deep conviction. Maybe they're not as convinced. So it is a team effort. Hopefully this was helpful. I will be posting a summary of my conversation with Ed on the Fireside PM Substack as well. And if you're watching this on LinkedIn, just know that this whole podcast is available on audio podcasts as well as the Substack newsletter. And if you're hitting this on YouTube or the audio podcast, you can follow me on LinkedIn as well. So lots of ways to make sure you get the best product information and advice you can. Check out Ed Biden on LinkedIn and his website, Hustle Badger, where he has a ton of courses and artifacts and things. So clearly a smart dude. Hopefully we'll have him back on the show again in the future. With that, I'm going to say, let's get back to work. Bye, team.